Thank you so much all for coming. It's wonderful to see repeat faces. It's wonderful to see new faces. Um, David Zvi, how's it going?
It's going okay, as well as it can be going with
Okay.
three kids out of school.
I know exactly what you feel like. This is my refuge, the once a week where I run out of the house and find these wonderful, beautiful mahogany shelves and talk to people about their jobs. So, David, you're a book publisher, and from what I understand, there's two interesting things about you as a book publisher. One is that it's not really your main hustle; it's kind of your side hustle, and you sort of fell into it by accident. So why don't you tell us, first of all, what do you do otherwise? And then how did you get into book publishing and stuff like that?
Sure. So my main hustle is that I am a fellow in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Um, but I've been doing publishing now for 6 years. This is something that I started when I was in grad school. I was in the Department of Near Eastern Languages at the University of Pennsylvania, looking at medieval Jewish and Islamic law, which sounds to me very interesting, but to you maybe as interesting as not as interesting. And while I was pursuing the degree, it started to concern me that many of the things that I was studying and many of the things that I would hopefully be publishing would be available only to a very small number of people. I care really deeply about having Jewish knowledge be accessible to as many people as possible. And so in the middle of the degree, I made the probably unwise decision to found a publishing house. The house started really as a result of a single book. A couple of friends of mine, or I should say two pairs of friends of mine, were each getting married or were going to be getting married in the next few months. And they were each looking for a bencher to have at their wedding. So many Jewish weddings have, towards the end of the ceremony, a small booklet of prayers that people can use for the purposes of the end of the ceremony itself to conclude the meal, but it's also kind of memento for the wedding. And over the years, these have become more and more simplified, basically because they need to be mass produced for weddings. These friends of mine were looking to make something, a kind of venture that didn't currently exist on the market, both because they wanted it to have Yiddish in it, and also because they wanted it to be accepting of queer couples and to have language in it that accepted the possibility not just of man and woman getting married, but also of man and man or woman and woman or whatever configuration. This really started out of a desire to create a single book, but then the thought was, and this, I know this train of thought probably doesn't make a lot of sense, was, well, if you're making a single book, maybe you should start a publishing house to publish both this and many other books going forward. And so it really started like that and has been going forward ever since.
So for those of you who haven't seen it, it is a wonderful venture. It is definitely in my top two ventures of all time.
What's the other one?
I like the Koran because it's new and it's clean and it's a beautiful interface.
Oh, they're the competition.
I know, but there's really no other competition, right? The million NCSY ventures, we'll put that on the side. The Nivarech venture, what you have done with your publishing house in general, which I found fascinating, is that the aesthetic is just as important, and not in a as clean, super minimalist. We are going to over design this to the nth degree. We're going to design it. It's going to be beautiful, but it's going to still feel homemade, and that's true with many of the products that you are putting out. When you put out this venture, was it like, because you're an academic, and for those of you who want to know a whole lot about the world of Jewish timekeeping and halachic timekeeping, I encourage you to read David Zvi's thesis on it. But that's, again, a different story. Did you go and look at the history of the beer cone, the bencher, and say, where did this come from? How do we honor it in some real deep way? Or was this just, well, we have this bencher, we're just going to put this out?
So as it happened, the year that the venture came out marked half a millennium since the first venture was published, which means that basically ventures have been published basically for as long as printing presses have existed. It's one of the books that has been, longest continuous printing history. probably of almost any book except the Bible and other religious texts. So it was very much the goal in creating the book to have this be both a contemporary venture, but also one that was fully informed by the long history of Jewish publishing and the long history of Jewish printing. So that meant, for example, that many of the illustrations in the book are stolen from medieval manuscripts, both Jewish and Christian. One of the hallmarks of Jewish book production is that it frequently, not just in my case, but frequently took illustrations from non-Jewish texts. For example, one of the first editions of Rashi used a kind of large illustration on the front page that was originally produced for a copy of Aesop's Fables. So this is there's a long history of this. So it involved that. There was also very careful thought into the typefaces used throughout the book, right? So they weren't just randomly chosen, but they were chosen to represent the kind of the specific language. They were chosen to be very old, historic, reconstructed typefaces. And so it was really carefully thought out. And it was also designed, I should say, to be a little bit difficult to interpret. One of the philosophies behind this book, and I think also many of the other books that Printocraft produces, is that a good book should have layers. And having layers means that on the one hand, the book, when you first encounter it, excites and you're like, wow, I love this book. But then as you go into it, that wow doesn't fade. You don't feel like, okay, there was an initial moment of this is great, but then I feel like I got everything that there is to get out of this book. The idea is that the more you go into a book, the more it gives back to you. I think that's true of basically every text that stands the test of time. It's certainly true of the Bible. It's certainly true of the Talmud. And the idea was to, not explain anything, right? This is a venture that has a lot of illustrations, but basically no explanation, no commentary whatsoever. In part with the idea being that people will go out and try to figure out why we made the decisions that we did.
Well, a lot of it has to, there's a lot in the footnotes. Right. When you talk about layers to unpack, I find that, going into the footnotes, especially in your venture, often illuminates a lot of things that I think might actually be going on there or not. But again, so.
Yeah, but there's only one page of footnotes. There's only a single page of footnotes.
Single point type.
Yes, the type was literally, we did tests to see how small can we make this type and still be legible. Yeah. Because we wanted it to be there, but to be as difficult to access as possible.
So you're really positioning yourself, I guess, when we're talking about this, as a publishing house that is different from other publishing houses. And in that, you highlight what a typical publishing house might be and how you want to stand in contrast to that. What other features do you think is going on that one might know or one might not know about a typical publishing house, Jewish or not, that you set yourself, this is the status quo and I need to take a stand against this by using my platform, my publishing?
So I wouldn't go so far as to say that I'm taking a stand against other Jewish publishing houses, because I have a lot of respect for the very difficult work that places like Koren or Kutav or whoever else is doing. But one part of one important philosophy in Printocraft was that this is a for-profit business. A lot of Jewish publishing is heavily funded by people who have an interest in not just creating Jewish books, but then creating particular Jewish books, right? I'm sure you can imagine, I'm sure on the bookshelf behind you, that many of the books up there have the specific sponsors listed either on the cover of the book or, on one of the first pages. A lot of Jewish publishing works like that. There's like an agenda. There's like, this book needs to exist. Therefore, I'm going to fund its publishing and it will exist in the world. That's really important. There's a lot of important books, like, for example, the Schottenstein Talmud, for example.
I was going to say the Pritzker Zohar.
Yeah. There's no way that those books would have been created if not for that kind of funding. On the other hand, what it does is it kind of de-emphasizes the role of the market. And I really believe that it's actually important that Jewish books be produced with an eye towards what the market is actually interested in. And so part of the point of having Printocraft be a for-profit is that it's supposed to make money just off of the quality of the books and not off of the fact that some wealthy person thinks that this book should exist in the world. Not that that's unimportant. I mean, there's like obviously a hugely important role to Jewish philanthropy. I work in my day job at a nonprofit organization. But specifically for the purposes of publishing, it's important that the books actually achieve some kind of market interest.
So that's interesting, because you would think that in theory, Random House isn't taking books that have named editions after that, because to them it's exactly that philosophy. But you're saying that the vast majority of Jewish publishing does not work necessarily in that way, and that if somebody has an idea for a book, even if they think 20 people will read it, they can go to any other publishing company and say, I think this is valuable. I will pay for the entire thing end to end, and then basically they become publishing on demand. And that's not the way that you want to be working.
Correct.
So as a result, you don't have that many books in your stable, but they're constants, and they go through. I'm guessing they've been selling regularly. So aside from a venture, you have, tell us a little bit about some of the other ones, especially I understand that you have an award-winning one that won an award yesterday.
Yeah, so so Printercraft started, and there was a real focus on creating books that were graphically illustrated, that were beautifully illustrated. But we also have branched out recently into academic books, and so the first academic book that we published came out last year. It's called A Rainbow Thread, and it's the first ever anthology of queer Jewish literature, going from the first century to 1969, so meaning like until the Stonewall riots. That was the endpoint that we chose. This book really came about because of a really smart guy who actually just got his doctorate, named Noam Sienna, who for years had kind of been collecting material that reflected in some small way the queer Jewish experience. Often it wasn't, it didn't have a name. And he tried to kind of put that together. I think a lot of times, one of the issues that queer Jews have is that there's a sense that history is an obstacle, not a friend. That, the history is just going to be a series of sources which say all the reasons why the life that a queer person is living is wrong or corrupted or needs to be changed. But the truth of the matter is that kind of hidden inside of those sources, there's actually a very interesting body of work that actually suggests there were gay people in the past. There were people whose gender identity was more complicated than just male or female. And so this was an attempt to kind of resurrect that history so that we could, use that history. And I think use that history not just, as a problem, but as something to be celebrated and to be explored more deeply. So that came out. It's done, I think, very well. Certainly it's done very well for an academic book. And yes, so this week it won a Lambda Award, so a kind of major LGBTQ award as their winning anthology for the year.
Amazing. So maybe you can take a step back and tell us a little bit about the difference, because while in theory, Kitav and Koren they're getting sponsorships, but they're also trying to sell books. The world of academic publishing is fundamentally different. And I think that probably virtually everybody in this room has no clue that publishers like Brill exist that are publishing very, very important anthologies of work, but selling 24 copies maybe at $500 a pop. So tell us a little bit about that world and how you see Printercraft going into the academic world as being different, and your philosophy of it.
So it's a good question. I can't say that I am that intimately familiar with the inner workings of academic publishing, but I do know that price is not the primary concern when an academic press publishes a work. And so it's very common to have a work that's, say 200, 300 pages that is selling for, $80, $100, $150, because the expectation is that normal people are not ever going to buy this, that they're basically only accessible to libraries. Actually, one of the interesting things that's happening now, because libraries are, for the most part, closed, is that there's a whole bunch of academics who would normally go to the library to use these extremely expensive books and actually can't access them now. And so some of these academic presses are, for the first time, offering are offering their books available for at prices that mere mortals can afford.
Yes, I've noticed this. There's a lot of sales going on, a lot of the
So
academic presses.
yeah, so I think that's probably a good thing. But the business model of these presses is basically keeps many people away. And if you have an academic affiliation, that's fine. If you have an academic affiliation, you can basically get any book, any article you want for free. But most people do not have those kinds of affiliations, and so the effect is that this just keeps a lot of knowledge unavailable to many people.
So are you then committed to putting out, if you're going to put out academic books, to only put out books that you think might have a wider audience appeal? Or if you see something that you think is very important, an important monograph on the history of 16th century halachic timekeeping that you decide is very important, but 20 people are going to buy, is this something that you say Printercraft is not so different? Or are you going to really say, I would love to put this out, I want to read this, but ultimately Printercraft is committed still to this model of being in some way solvent?
So I would say at this point, I'm not interested in publishing books that are only going to sell 100 copies. There's other people who can do that, good on them. So I really am interested in making sure that the press publishes books that are actually going to sell. At the same time, it's not, the press isn't just about making money. Part of it is also about the belief that the books that we're publishing actually matter. And so actually to that end, and this is an email, we've sent out this notice actually a few times over the course of the press history, but we sent it out, I think last week or the week before, an email to basically everyone who's ever bought books from us saying, this is a difficult time, many people are unemployed. If there is a book in our library that you would like, but you cannot afford, just email us and we'll work it out. And people have emailed us, and we've sold books for far less than the list price, in part just because I want people to have the books. And there is a real disparity. I think most of our books right now sell for between $20 and $35. For some people, that is not a lot of money. For some people, that's an incredible amount of money. That's like a real investment. And I think that's especially true for students who often don't have the funds. So this is an attempt to kind of to deal with that problem.
Amazing. So what other books are in your stable? What else do you have? I mean, I'm pretty sure I have the full run, but why don't you tell us?
So one of our best sellers, and it's been this way for many years now, is the illustrated Pirkei Avot. So it's a copy of Pirkei Avot, which is presented as a graphic novel. This was produced by the artist Jessica Tamar Deutsch. It actually came out of a project that she was doing as a kind of final project when she was in art school. And we kind of developed it with her.
Art school, not art scroll.
Art school, yes. So we developed it with her over a few years into what it is today, and I think it's done very well. One of the things I like about it is that it's certainly, I see it given a lot as bar and bat mitzvah gifts. It's also often shows up in summer camps. Obviously, not so much this year, and it shows up as kind of end of the year presents for different elementary school, middle school classes. But there's also many adults who read it. One of the things that I think has worked really well with that book is, there's some Jewish books which are wonderful, but you can't really access them without the help of a teacher. The Talmud probably being the primary example. I think it's very, very hard to kind of get interested in Talmud without at least one other person actually kind of like pointing the way. But I think this Pirkei Avot actually is one of the few Jewish books which can excite people, even in the absence of kind of any framework, which I think especially right now during a pandemic is important because like that framework just doesn't exist.
Yes, correct. So there are books on the one hand that you believe in that need to have teachers there, right? The academic side of things, a bencher that has things that are sometimes obscured, and you believe also very much in the democratization, the autonomy of the individual to read books and to go forward with that. You bring up, this is not necessarily a children's book, although some children have read it. My kids have gone across it. The world of Jewish children's publishing is a completely different world with its own own set of rules and discussions and stuff like that. Is there any thoughts about expanding into children's literature? What can you say about that without, or even with talking about whatever your thoughts are on the behemoth in the library of the referred to as PJ Library?
Sure. So yes, there is that intention, and actually we have a book under contract right now in development that is intended for children, that is about how a Sefer Torah is made. And that is actually, speaking, you're based in Montreal, right?
I am.
So the text was produced by Jen Taylor Friedman.
Amazing. She's a great colleague of mine. Julie is a Sofared herself, so
amazing.
as well.
So that book is in the works. And I imagine that there'll be more children's books. I can't say that we've had success with PJ Library. I think every single book that we've suggested to them has been rejected. But I think that is okay. And also I think, there's a lot, I certainly know there's a lot of people who are interested in producing Jewish children's literature who see a rejection by PJ Library as basically like, this is not a good Jewish book. And I encourage people to not see it that way, right? Like PJ Library has a very, very large, readership, and that readership demands all kinds of different things from them. I know that they've, people have been upset with them for all kinds of different reasons because of books they publish, and it's very, very hard to make a Jewish book that everyone's going to like, that feels substantive, and doesn't bother anybody. They have their particular interest, but that doesn't mean that there aren't Jewish books, Jewish children's books that can be produced outside of that framework, which also have a strong value.
This is interesting because, people see PJ Library as, well, if I get a PJ Library book, I really made it. But the reality is they're selling so many books and they have to appeal to such a broad audience that if you actually have a book that can appeal to 10% of the audience of what PJ Library would ultimately sell, you still have an incredibly successful book by many other measures, which is really gets you to think about the scope of how many people buy books and how many people, actually PJ Library serves versus how many people are buying the average book that's out there. Interesting. Where's the future of Jewish publishing? Because I'm committed. I buy books omnivorously, right? So I buy many books on paper for many reasons, partially because it's an art book, which could be beautiful and I really want a copy of it. But I have been known, if I can't get a copy at a reasonable price, to spend the $20 instead of the $80 on an ebook version of a coffee table book, just because I want the content just as much. So I buy ebooks. I like notating on ebooks. Where's the future of Jewish publishing going? Are you thinking about these things? I'm sure you are. And where do you see, for example, Printercraft as well as the larger Jewish publishing world going with regards to that?
So digital is definitely going to be part of it. Printercraft right now basically has no digital books, and that is intentional, both because of the value of actually having a physical book in your hands, which I don't think is going to go away. I think maybe 15, 20 years ago when ebooks first started to become a thing, there were all these think pieces about, it's the end of books, ebooks is the future. And I don't know that anybody actually thinks that anymore. Ebooks definitely have achieved a market share, but physical books are still in demand, and I don't think the demand for physical books is going to go away anytime soon. Part of the difficulty of having digital books, I think especially for a small press like ours, is that piracy is a real issue, right? And once a book is available in a digital format, it's very easy to just lose control of this. And so because of that, it's just kind of in some ways too risky to digitize the book. So we've kind of like adamantly stayed away from that. But that being said, I do think there is there's a digital future. I'm interested for digital books to see ways in which the format can do things that physical books cannot. I think this Safari app, for example, has done a good job of this in kind of hyperlinking text, making it easy to jump from one text to another. That's been around for a while now. I imagine that there's ways of incorporating multimedia into static text, which is also going to be interesting. But at the same time, that's not really my primary focus. The primary focus is still on making excellent physical books, in part because there's a kind of simplicity to sitting with an actual book. There's a way that you kind of feel that you're in the presence of something when you're with a physical book that simply does not exist in the same way when you are online. This is something which I think about, so part of my work as an academic is on the relationship between Jewish history and the history of technology. And now, as we're all kind of spending all this time in virtual space, I know that we're all spending a lot of time thinking about ways in which virtual space online feels different than space in the real world. And I think one of the things certainly I'm finding, maybe you're finding as well, is that it doesn't feel real in the same way. Even though we try very hard to make virtual spaces like Zoom feel real, it's still missing something. And so some of that I think is permanent. And I think it's worth kind of like investing in physical books right now as a kind of alternative to a virtual space, which is just going to kind of swallow up more and more of our lives.
Yeah, it's funny. The first day that I was stuck at home back in March, and I was like, oh, this could be a week, this could be 2 weeks, this could be a month. I have no idea where this is going. But all of a sudden I looked around my library. This is not my library, this is at the shul, but the library I have at home, which is fairly well stocked. I was like, oh, I'm prepared for this, right? I've spent my whole life buying books so that I know that if I'm stuck in my house for 23 hours a day for 6 months, right, I'm gonna be fine. Right, and you can't always say the same for digital books. But you talk about the intersection, and if I can geek out a little bit on this, and we can just tell me, where you're thinking in terms of publishing. I actually think, and this really fits into our conversation, past, present, and future. I think that one of the major schisms that is going to be happening within the Orthodox versus liberal or traditional versus Haredi orthodoxy, however you're going to define it, is that at some point, publishing technology, print publishing technology is going to become so expensive to the point that books are going to be very expensive to publish, and there's going to be an allowance in some way for an ebook to be used in Shul on Shabbat. Right, for a Siddur and a Chumash that will have to, right, because it will just cost, $600. I happen to have, this is not a prop planned, but I happen to have this, right? This is going to cost $600 to publish, and we're not going to be able to have, 800 of them in our shuls or 200 of them in our shuls. And there will be a modern Orthodox approach to saying you can use this sort of e-ink, this sort of technology, this kind of reader in shul in this way, and that's it. And the Haredi society will go and say, no, absolutely not. There's no way that we're going to be able to do this. And we will return to family chumashim, where this becomes like a wedding gift that you receive, or a bar mitzvah gift that you treasure. It's on heavy paper, and Art Scroll will be buying up all the old printing presses and maintaining that culture of, really old publishing. I think that is the split that things are going to go, because at some point, it won't make sense. It makes sense for the next 5 years, for 10 years, but in 20 years, I don't see a lot of, willy-nilly publishing of so much material. What do you think about this, and how off base? I'm curious your thoughts on this, because this really will impact the future of publishing.
So I'm not sure that I share your concern. My sense is that, certainly I know from dealing with American printers, a lot of them are in trouble now. There have been some significant mergers, and there is, I know that I've experienced, and I know that actually other Jewish presses have experienced issues with quality control. That being said, there's still lots of printers. There's lots of cheap printers. I think what may happen is that a lot of printing of Jewish books goes to China, which, has already happened. If you look at a lot of PJ library books, for example, you'll see a lot of them are already printed in China. And that is not so different from a lot of other Judaica, which is also frequently printed in China. So there's some ways nothing really new about this. I'm not so concerned about the price going up, in part because one of the things that we've seen over the last few years is the rise of print on demand, which basically takes the price of individual books down quite a bit, right? Traditionally, one of the things that has been an obstacle to publishing a book is that there is a significant setup cost for every book. So if you don't sell X number of copies, you won't make any money. But with print on demand, basically every book costs the same amount of money to print. There's no setup cost, because they're basically just glorified laser printers.
So what you're saying is that my favorite hobby, which is browsing for academic remainders, is going to die because there's not going to be anything like this anymore.
I don't know. But I guess I'm not so concerned about ebooks taking over physical books in ritual spaces. And I think actually one of the things that religions have the ability to do, which is more difficult outside of religious context, is preserve old technologies which they find meaningful. And so, in the same way that we've kept the Sefer
scribes.
Torah around
Mhm.
for thousands of years while everyone else has ditched it, I think we'll have books for a very, very long time.
Yeah, so you need a Sefer Torah, but you need one Sefer Torah. Whereas in theory, we've come a culture to the idea for the past 500 years that we all need a copy of a certain amounts of books, right? And that's where my concern, and I guess we can, I really think at some point, right, the many publishing as opposed to publishing on demand. But I don't know, you are in the business, you know it more than I do. I see already people in the modern Orthodox world are edging towards those kinds of conversations. And I think that it's going to become one of these things where like Haredim will absolutely never touch a print book. Although Koren has refused, and I've spoken to them multiple times about this, they will not publish an app version of their Talmud, and ArtScroll already has. So, they're committed to the print version, and ArtScroll has already gone and said, you can have the Talmud in your thing, and that's it. Where are the outer reaches for you of thinking about publishing? Meaning, what is no longer considered publishing? What are you interested in, but you say, this is beyond my control? And where do you see, what's in the pipeline for you guys for Printercraft? If you can share with us some of the stuff that's coming up.
Sure. So I think we're looking at the children's publishing more and more. I think one of the things that's actually in the works now is an illustrated version of Megillat Ruth. And
Also by Jessica Tamar-Deutsch, or
no, by a different artist.
Okay.
And I think there's probably a few more things that are going to come out in the next couple of years. It's still a press that operates pretty slowly. It's fine. I think we're focusing on quality over quantity. I hope with all these books that we end up producing something which stands the test of time. One of the strategies for Printercraft is not just to produce books, but to produce kind of perennials. So, right, you can produce a novel. A novel kind of like has half-life. Right, like, it's interesting, people read it for a while, and then people get bored of it. If you kind of stick towards traditional Jewish texts, then it becomes more of an investment. So I think that, for the moment, is more of a focus.
Interesting. Okay. Are there any other things that we haven't yet hit? The thing that I want to mention that David Zvi has not yet mentioned is he is the American distributor for the Asufa Haggadah, which, if you haven't seen it, is an unbelievable piece of work where every year they this design firm in Israel invites 50 or so designers to do a 2-page spread of the Haggadah and publishes it almost like an art book, but it's highly usable and it's very beautiful. And if you want one in America, you basically have to go through David Zvi, and so kudos on you for doing that one. Maybe you'll find me some of those out of print ones that nobody.
We're still having trouble with access to Canada. Yeah,
we'll work on that one. Don't worry. Is there any other areas of the publishing world that you haven't told us about that you're dying to get off your chest?
No, I don't think so. I think, look, to me, Jewish publishing exists on a continuum with other forms of Jewish expression. And so there's some things that you can do with books. There's some things that you can't do with books. There's some things that, for example, you need to do with podcasts, or with music, or with physical art objects. And so, Printercraft.
Yes, I've noticed the Rothko Talmud behind you.
Yeah. For sale for whoever's interested. But yeah, so, I think there's different modes in which Jewish expression can exist. Publishing is just one of them right now.
So that's amazing. Well, it was a piece that I actually had in mind that one of the amazing things about Printercraft is that with you at the head of it, you are the best marketer in the sense that you're just out there always. You have an active online presence, whether doing podcasts, whether on Jewish Live, whether on My Jewish Learning, whether just being on Facebook and publishing random thoughts that come out of your head. And I think that draws a lot of people to who you are and to finding out. And that's one of the best ways that you can possibly market yourself, is like, people think to themselves, oh, a podcast is useless. But I'm like, no, a podcast tells you about who the person is. And then you find out that this person is actually putting out great material. Can you tell us, as our last question, what was the most out there thing that happened to you, or a book that was presented to you for possible publication that you were like, I can't ever see why this would ever cross somebody's mind to publish? Like, what's your crazy stories from the field, or most bonkers rejected possible printercraft submission?
I don't know that we've gotten anything truly bonkers. I think a lot of the people who come to us are really earnest, and they sometimes they have poetry which they're interested in publishing. They have artwork that they think might be of interest to the press. So I think I've actually just been surprised and humbled by how serious the proposals have been to the press. So it can kind of go in different directions. Yeah.
The record, by the way, I'm a recipient of a rejection of Printercraft. I had pitched something to him that I thought was so up their alley, and you were like, nope, it's not what we do. And I was like, okay, done. Yeah.
But I'll say, I guess, like, actually, just to say one more thing, because, on the topic of what books can do and what books can't do. One thing that I think about as a publisher, but also as an artist, is the way in which Jewish books can serve as symbols, but symbols that actually are kind of fig leaves. They don't actually mean something. They're kind of like there as symbols of piety, but not actually show something. I think, we could not have asked for a better example of this than the president's photo shoot with a Bible in front of a church, holding a Bible in the way that, like, no one actually holds a book. So there's ways in which books can actually can hide something, meaning something quite different. So I'll just show you. I brought there's an art object which I've been working on, which hasn't been displayed yet, and I am looking for a forum in which to display it. But I worked with an artist in Boston named Rachel Jackson. To produce,
we like Rachel Jackson.
To produce this object, to show it to you. So this looks like a siddur. It
also looks like a deck of cards.
Looks like a deck of cards, and actually, if you open it up, it has cigarettes inside. And the idea behind, like, this object was intended to be controversial. And a little bit provocative. The idea being that there is a way in which objects like books can be used for bad purposes. There's a lot of different interpretations for this particular object, but there's a limit to what books can do. I say that even as I publish more of them.
Okay. Thank you so much. This has been really enlightening. I highly recommend to everybody to follow all David Zvi's goings-ons online. And in the world of print, you should definitely check out his website. It's shabb.es, so shabb.es, I believe. Yeah. I've worked with some of those domains where you get to, like, play with the end ones. They're a lot of fun. And to follow him on various social medias, follow him. Go see him if you ever have a chance, if we ever get to meet face to face, and to buy his books. So thank you so much, David Zvi, and we'll be in touch. And I will contact you offline about the Rothko Talmud. Right. It's a fascinating piece.
Thanks for having me.